Hello and welcome to this special video edition of Kitchen Excellence Week 2023. I'm delighted to be joined today by Richard Fordham, who is a Director of Kitech Solutions, and he's here to talk about the topic of kitchen optimisation. Richard, your business is dedicated to supporting hospitality operators that wish to optimise electrical commercial catering equipment. Tell us how you actually go about doing that.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Basically, we have a system of hardware and software that, in very simple terms, studies all of the connected appliances that we're looking to optimize, and regulates how they how much they draw, the maximum draw is, to make sure that any predefined threshold, and that can be the limit of the electrical capacity that we've got available. In Europe, it's more the maximum tariff terms, to make sure we never exceed that. So it's basically a smart signaling and a smart switching system. We tend to concentrate on the larger consumers of power. So this will be things like your primary cooking equipment, your warewashing, your combi ovens. Certain elements aren't suitable for it. We don't optimize refrigeration, for example, and things like coffee machines. So it is the bigger items. But typically, what we're able to do is, for argument's sake, if you have a kitchen that has a connected load, once you look at a services schedule of say 200 kilowatts, we will typically run that on less than 100 at the maximum peak. So it's very much over here. We see it very much as an infrastructure solution. And I think now, particularly with that move towards more electric kitchens, it's becoming more and more prevalent, without a doubt. We know the grid's under a huge amount of pressure. But in simple terms, that's what it does. It's a clever switching system that makes sure we never exceed the maximum power threshold that we've got available to us. Okay.
Let's talk about how user-friendly the system is. Does it have to be closely managed by the operator, by the user, or can they just let it run in the background and let it do its work?
Typically, we prefer them to just let it run in the background. There's nothing really for them to do. When we set the system up, and quite early in the process, we'll look at what elements we need to be optimizing, or we need to be looking to optimize. And then when it comes to commissioning, it's also part of a process that we sit down with the client and understand what they're doing, because it may be that we need to lock certain appliances out for certain times. For argument's sake, if you've got a pastry section where they're doing something like a hot chocolate souffle, we wouldn't want to optimize the oven in which that's being cooked, because it's a very delicate product. So we can actually take that out of the system for a number of hours each day, but we preset all that. The customer can go in and override if needs be, or we can do it remotely. But in simple terms, there's very little interaction that the customer needs to do, and quite often they're actually not aware it's even there. In some instances, if it's been installed as part of a larger project, they sometimes don't even know it's there. It's just ticking away in the background for them.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. What about when it comes to the operators themselves and the benefits that they might see from this solution? What kind of operators would benefit most from the system, and what kind of results could they expect to see?
I think that's changed dramatically in the last 18 months. I think prior to that, our business demographic was very much the sort of design consultant-led projects, where they're establishing at quite an early age what their power limitations are. Or they tended to be quite rural projects or specific one-offs where, again, getting power available to a site was difficult. So they tended to be quite often rural locations, where the cost of upgrading a supply would be potentially huge. And we did a couple where they were quoted in excess of $250,000 to upgrade their power supply, and it was clearly a non-starter. That has changed dramatically in the last 18 months, where we've seen a lot of the group operators, the restaurant chains, announcing their net zero targets and their net zero policies, and deciding that they're going to get rid of gas. They've looked at their estate and realised it's not quite that easy. We have a significant infrastructure problem. So we're now seeing some of the brewery chains, the restaurant chains. We had a brewery chain referred to us last week. I think they're looking at about 15 refurbs in the next year, all of which are very gas centric, which they want to move away from. But when you look at some of their locations, they're challenging for them. So we've been brought in to do a study, to have a look, and see if we can optimize those. So the business demographic has changed very much so. But going back to my earlier comment, when you look at what they can expect to achieve, it's on average it's up to 50% and often more of a reduction on that theoretical load.
Okay. And you mentioned there the trend in terms of gas kitchens and particularly brewers and pub companies moving towards electrification. Presumably, I mean, that trend is only going to increase. That must be having a big impact on your business and how you operate in that space.
Yeah, hugely so. And I think that the level of inquiry we've had over the last year, 18 months, has, or certainly the last year, has increased dramatically. And even take that back to a smaller window, the last 6 months, that trajectory has been quite dramatic. So yes, and I think the more this gathers pace and the more it gets closer to those perceived target dates of 2030 or whatever, the more that is going to build. So it's definitely not going to go away. We know the issues with regard to grid capacity and renewables and all of that. So yeah, it's a topic that's here to stay for a considerable time, I think.
Yeah, sure. Energy optimization, will be a topic that isn't familiar to everybody. Not everybody will have experience of it. What would you say is the most common misconception around the subject?
We quite often get asked, how much energy is it going to save us? And we have to answer and say, we can't actually put a figure on that, and it won't save energy per se. The biggest misconception is people think they're going to reduce consumption. But to do that, you've got to change the laws of physics, which we're good, but we're not that good. No one can do that. It's you need a certain number of kilowatts to heat a liter of water 1 degree. We can't change that. So that's probably the biggest one. And it's a shame sometimes when we get people come through to us to say, "Oh, their electricity bill is very high. Can you do anything to reduce it?" And at that stage, it's probably too late. That said, there are ways you can reduce consumption by blocking appliances out and reducing the amount of time they're turned on unnecessarily, which is something that we're all familiar with. We've all gone into kitchens at 9 o'clock in the morning or before that, and everything's on. There's no service going on, but everything is blaring away, typically with the old gas kitchens. But even so with electric now, less so with induction clearly, but even some of the all electric kitchens, we find that as a situation. So if we can manage that and help to drive behavioural change there, then that's a good thing. But that is the biggest misconception, that it can change consumption per se, and it won't. It's looking to limit that maximum demand peak, that peak load. That's really what we're looking about managing. Okay.
And then finally, in terms of trying to join some of the dots here, where does kitchen connectivity fit into all of this? Is it the case that an operator would have to have the latest, greatest smart equipment in order to make energy optimization really work for them?
I think on that front, when we look at the majority of companies that we work with, in terms of manufacturers, certainly the Northern Europeans are all over it, and they have been for 20, 30 years. So we're quite late to the game in a way. So the American companies less so. It doesn't sort of seem to feature. So when it comes to an operator, there's not really a hard and fast rule. Certain appliances, certain manufacturers, yes, it's very easy to optimize. They build the interface that we need in at the factory. That's really, really easy. Others, we have to work around it with a wiring diagram, and we then have to engage with them in terms of, are we able to optimize your equipment? And other manufacturers, sadly, it's just not possible. So we have to do that study and look at what equipment a customer is using. It's not necessary that they have the latest equipment available. The chances are, certainly if it's let's say Northern European, if it is, then it's going to have that interface or that dialogue with the energy optimization there in any case. But looking at the wider aspect of connectivity, some of the data that you can then extract out of the system helps to drive that behavioral change that I touched on earlier on. We had a situation probably about less than a year ago now, about 6-8 months ago, with a site that, again, they were using a huge amount of electricity. The system was in. We identified that with the fryers in particular, we're able to see the number of hours an appliance is turned on for, and then what its thermal activity is. So in other words, how long it's been cooking for. And one of these fryers, well, there was 2 of them. On average, they were on for about, it was an 8-week period, on for about 500 hours, which is about typical. One of them cooked for 17 hours, so it was 3%. And the rest of the time it was just on, churning over power. And the other one was 8%. And it was like, well, there straight away is an easy win for you. Turn your fries off. You know, you're not using them. When we actually pulled that data out, I mean, Andy and I were our chins just hit the floor. It was like, wow, that's huge. 97% wasted time. It was just massive. So if you can use that data to help educate the customer and then drive that behavioral change, that's great. But as I've said, when I've talked about connectivity in general, you've got to have that data to make those informed decisions. You can't act on a hunch. You need to have something backing it up. And this was I mean, I've used it in presentations ever since, because it was just one that people look up and sit up and take notice of those figures.